for doing the good things in the world. My host, Gary, and she will some song. Soundtrack of why we are.
Martin Luther King's dream. In the dis-United States, and no place like home, a Black woman's journey through the deep South. In the whole world, you know, there's a million boys and girls who are young, gifted, and Black, and that's a fact. Born in Hertfordshire to Barbadian parents, in his final year at Harriet Watt, he was awarded a bursary from The Guardian to study journalism at Sydney University and started working at The Guardian in 1993. In 1996, he was awarded the Lawrence Stern Fellowship, which sends a young British journalist to work at the Washington Post for 3 months. How to be young, gifted, and Black? Oh, how I long to know the truth. After several years of reporting from all over Europe, Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean, Gary was appointed The Guardian's U.S. correspondent in 2003, writing first from New York and then Chicago. In 2015, he returned to London, where he became The Guardian's editor-at-large. There are times when I look back and I'm haunted by my youth. His books have also received considerable acclaim. For example, in 2017, Another Day in the Death of America won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize from Columbia Journalism School and Neiman Foundation. In terms of his academic career in 2020, he left The Guardian to take up an academic post at the sociology department at Manchester University. Currently a visiting
police brutality, racial inequality,
systemic injustice, a dream deferred, tamed by the word. Caribbean at the crossroads, racism rebooted. Yes, he tried. What will Barack Obama's legacy be? Shots in the dark. Don't blame Uncle Tom. We can't breathe. Riots are a class act. White History 101, why every single statue should come down. Black like me, she would not be moved. No surrender. Farewell to America. Round and round the storm turns. But inside the eye of the hurricane, time stops. A boy dances on the feet of his mother. She smiles because she understands what we will only later discover through the happy consequence of what it means to be young, gifted, and Black. The Journal of American Studies is proud to present Gary Younge.
Thank you, Nicole, for what is the most lyrical, and I say that as a. Does that mean I'm taller than Nicole? So rarely happens. Such a beautiful lyrical introduction. Thank you. So I'm going to talk for a little while about what's in the book and why I did it, and kind of what I've made of the book, and then Nicole and I are going to talk, and then we'll all talk together. And I want to start by talking about the category, the Black diaspora, which is the Caribbean, America, Britain, wherever Black people are, which is all over the world. And the fact that from the beginning of my career, there's been a kind of challenge with that category. So the second book I did was called Stranger in a Strange Land, which was about articles about America. Nobody ever said to me, why do you write about America? Or why would you concentrate on America in the way that you do? But when it comes to issues around race, this has plagued my entire career. The first column that I did for The Guardian was spiked. It was about Bosnia, and the editor, not of the whole paper, but of the comment section, said, we don't really need you for that. We have other people that can do that, unless you can add an ethnic sensibility to this. So I was like, it's Bosnia. You know, it doesn't need any more ethnic sensibilities than the ones that it has. And there was always this challenge that either I could only write about race, or I shouldn't write about race at all. That was the other one. You know, be careful, you'll be pigeonholed, always in the passive voice. Nobody ever kind of, you know, I'd say, why, because race is written about so well, because there are so many good Black journalists, what is the issue? You will be pigeonholed. And I remember talking to Chris O'Feely, the artist, and asking him whether he'd ever had that warning. And he said, well, you know, the thing is, pigeons can fly. You know, it's really not the notion that that might be the worst thing in the world. But in any case, I thought, well, I don't control how I'm understood. And it made me think of the Steve Biko quote that the greatest thing in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. That if I spend my time worrying about what other people think of me, then I'll never get out of bed in the morning. And so, after almost 30 years of working at The Guardian, when I left to become a professor at the University of Manchester, I started thinking, well, maybe there is some value. Maybe there is some value in putting all of this together. That arguably 90%, maybe a bit less, of these pieces you could find on the internet if you went looking for them. But there was some value in putting them together and having a kind of a narrative, and a narrative being partly about me, really, but partly about the things that I'd seen, that in a way I had been blessed to have these front row seats in these certain moments, which I will talk about later. But not long after I left, I stopped working for The Guardian in January 2020. I took up my professorship in April 2020, and soon after came the murder of George Floyd. And at that point I thought, yeah, there's some real value to having this all in one place. But then the more, as it went on, and I would meet more people in the book industry who were kind of working on social media and other things, people who were younger, there was another realization, which is that if you're 27 or 28, Stephen Lawrence was always dead. Mandela was, so long as you were conscious, Mandela was the former leader of an African country. That if you're 27 or 28, then more or less for most of your kind of lived memory, there's been a black president. It's not so new. And that there was some value in putting all this together to make it kind of clear that a lot of this stuff didn't come from nowhere and what those antecedents are. That's another way of saying that I'm old. And realizing that if I'm old, other people are young, and that they have, you know, they will have a different perspective and they will have a different kind of historical positioning. But I've never been in flight from the category. You know, when people say, well, do you think of yourself as a black journalist or a journalist that happens to be black? And I think, well, what's the difference, actually? And I don't just happen to be black. I am black. And that doesn't, it may be limiting for you, but it's not limiting for me. And my only concern is that you, at a certain point, may limit me, but I'm not going to limit myself. So, that said, the book starts in '94. I joined The Guardian with a few day shifts as a translator. They have a section called Guardian Europe. They need someone who can look through the papers and find stories. And in my interview for a bursary a couple of years before, I was interviewed by the man who would become the editor, Alan Rusbridger, and I spoke about my interest and dedication to the anti-apartheid movement. And The Guardian is stuck in this classical liberal challenge. And that liberal challenge is that it is aware enough to know that there are stories in South Africa that its white journalists can't get. But it is not aware enough to have actually employed black journalists that they want to send and cover them. And so they look around, because they don't know what the stories are, they look around for somebody young, black, and cheap to send to South Africa. And I am the youngest, blackest, cheapest thing there is. And so I'm sent to South Africa at age 24, 25. I had been, as I said, I set up the Anti-Apartheid Society at Heriot-Watt University when I studied in Edinburgh. I'd been involved in the Edinburgh anti-apartheid movement. I had picketed the South African embassy with my mum. This was something that I cared about and was involved in. And so it was an overwhelming and incredible experience to stand in a stadium in the middle of nowhere, because that's where apartheid put black people by their thousands, hundreds of thousands actually, and to wait for Mandela to come. People who've never seen him before because they don't have a television apart from on a poster, and to see the entourage, the cavalcade, kicking up dust miles away because it's just veldt, there's nothing there. And as soon as they see the dust just kicking up in the distance, they start dancing, old women with no teeth, young children with no shoes, dancing, singing freedom songs, waving red, gold, and black, green, and gold banners, just having the time of their lives, and the dust getting closer, the cars getting bigger, the noise getting greater, and then at a certain point, the cars would stop, and Mandela would climb out and get onto the back of a van, and then he would do 2 laps of the stadium. And I wrote a piece called The Black Knight. I described him as a black knight on a white horse coming to slay apartheid, and that was the piece that got me my job. And the only thing, so it was a terrific experience. The one thing that made it particularly odd and particularly amazing was that I couldn't drive at the time. I didn't have a driving license. Actually, my driving license expired, so I still don't have a driving license. But I couldn't drive, and so I would have to get lifts from people, and I would pay them in money and conversation, and then people would drop, different people would drop me back, particularly if the conversation wasn't very good. And at a certain point, I was dropped at a gas station, and somebody said, "Mandela's bodyguards are coming through." No, some people are coming through and they'll pick you up. And it was Mandela's bodyguards. And I amused them. I made it my business to amuse them, frankly. And I had studied in the Soviet Union, as had they. I'd been involved in the anti-apartheid movement. I'd been a fellow traveler around the communist movement. They weren't fellow travelers, they were travelers in the communist movement. And so after that one trip, they would call me and they would say, well, we're going to so-and-so, do you want to come? And so I stumbled into Mandela's entourage. You have to imagine it's 2008 and somehow you stumble into Obama's entourage. That sometimes I was in the cavalcade, not in the stadium. So I had this very close up. I remember my editor saying, we want to know what he has for breakfast. We want to know, and just by being around, all of this stuff became daily, part of my daily experience for a few months. I was in heaven. It was terrific. And thankfully, I managed to produce a piece that gave some sense of the joy and wonder that I was experiencing. And that's where the book starts. Now, there is in the book a mixture of elements of journalism. One is reportage, like that. I went and I saw, covering Obama's election in 2008, coming into Katrina, New Orleans, in 2005, the Notting Hill Carnival and its practices and its history. Some of it is analysis. So one of the challenges that I had with journalism can really be understood through one of the adages that we were taught when I studied journalism at university, where they said, when a dog bites a man, it's always men, women don't get bitten apparently. When a dog bites a man, that's not a story. When a man bites a dog, that's a story. And the logic of that is clear, right? That there are things you expect, and when you expect them, it's not news. But after a while, I did start to wonder, because of what was expected and because of who was writing the news, that maybe sometimes actually what you need to ask is, well, who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? And what can we do about these dog bites? That quite often, those things that people said, well, that's not news to me. It was like, but you don't know anything about those people. You don't live there. You don't. So it's telling that there aren't more black people being shot dead by the police in America. That's not what happened. That's not what Black Lives Matter is about. What happened was that through a kind of certain alchemy, in a certain moment, African Americans rose up and said enough is enough. And the media decided that this was something that they would have to take on. And also, anyone could become a reporter in a certain moment. And then they can distribute, and then they can say, does this look normal to you? And so there was a dynamic that meant that newspapers couldn't ignore it. Similar thing with sexual harassment and Me Too. That what Me Too was, essentially was a large number of women coming out and talking about an experience which was known and told, but not kind of authenticated, not verified by the people who need to verify it to make it news. So sometimes we have to ask ourselves, who owns these dogs? And so some of the stories are, look, you know, this kid's been shot, dead, and his name didn't even make the paper. How can that happen? And then you find out that the person who shot him was an off-duty cop. And then you find out that the off-duty cop shot someone else dead in his neighborhood and shot his wife in a drunken dispute and killed someone else when he was drink driving, and he's still on the force. And the kid's name doesn't make the paper. How can that happen? And so some of them are stories which in general I had to struggle with editors and colleagues to say, no, this matters because actually it happens so often and we don't do anything about it. There's analysis of things like the Macpherson report. I go back to South Africa 5 years after Mandela. I go back 8 years after Obama. The first part of the book, there are 5 chapters. The first is called Change is Going to Come, and it's the more hopeful stories. And then the second is called Things Fall Apart, and it's the less hopeful stories. They generally have a kind of black theme title, apart from one chapter where I just couldn't think of one, which is called The Ways of Seeing, after John Berger. John Berger's famous book. And that one is almost like a series of thought experiments, almost, where I say, well, you know, let's just shift the template and think of it like this. So what would a White History Month look like? Not a racist history month, a white history month that took in, because Rosa Parks didn't kick herself off the bus, but we never hear about Mr. Blake. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know if he developed or if he didn't develop or what he made of the first black president or any of that, because most of Black History Month is told in the passive voice. People get kicked off. They get enslaved. They are segregated, but people did these things. But it's also true if you look at the cotton workers in Manchester in the 19th century who refused to touch slave cotton, or John Brown, or any number of, although it's always too small a number, of white people who were incredibly brave, and, you know, or Joe Slovo in South Africa, or, you know, wherever you are. And that, so what would White History Month look like? Or in defense of Uncle Tom, the literary character, who, if you read the book, I believe is a hero. Uncle Tom dies because he's murdered, because he refuses to tell the master where the other slaves have gone. He's not a revolutionary, he doesn't run away with them, but he won't tell where they've gone. And then I interrogate that slur to call someone an Uncle Tom and say, look, criticize people for what they do. Don't criticize them for who they are. If you don't like Priti Patel or Suella Braverman, and I don't, then don't make out like they are doing some terrible, like that they are terribly treacherous. There is nothing about your skin color that determines your moral value. Talk about, if there was, then Rwanda wouldn't happen, would it? Or, you know, any of the other, and the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. A range of things wouldn't have happened where you get same race people doing awful things. And then a piece that was a real, or I talk about maybe we should take down all of the statues, not just the ones of the people we don't like, but all of them. How useful are they? How great are they as elements of memory? If the issue is that taking them down is like erasing what happened and erasing history, then let's put that statue of Jimmy Savile back up in Glasgow. Why are you taking that down? Because it would be offensive to people? Well, just hold that thought, and then let's go back to Churchill or Colston or any of those people. And one of my more creative thought experiments, which was, let's just imagine that Boris Johnson were a black woman, just for a minute. More than a minute, and you kind of throw up in your mouth a little bit. He wouldn't have gone to Eton because black women couldn't go to Eton at the time. He wouldn't have been in the Bullingdon Club because women couldn't join the Bullingdon Club. That's where he made his contacts. He probably wouldn't have gone to Oxford because black women were stuck in the schools that didn't send people to Oxford. He wouldn't have had an uncle who got him a job at the Times because black women didn't have uncles who could get him a job at the Times. And when he gets fired for plagiarism, he wouldn't have got a second chance because black women don't get a second chance, and on and on and on. And my only regret in that article is the very obvious point that I missed, which is the hair. Can you imagine a black woman going out with hair like that? It would be the end. And then there are interviews. Express yourself after Charles Wright. I interview Angela Davis, who talks about diversity, the modern understanding of diversity as being the difference that brings no difference and the change that makes no change. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who basically falls asleep on me while I'm talking to him. Stormzy, who I wasn't particularly invested in when I went to interview him, but come away completely smitten and enamored by this incredibly clever, self-aware, engaged young man who is constantly in a state of development and who defies pretty much every crude prejudice and assumption about what a rapper is. And then there's one of the best days in my life where I am supposed to have 45 minutes with Maya Angelou, excuse me. And 13 hours later, I roll out of her stretch limo, hammered. Maya Angelou, I think, slightly less hammered. She can take her drink better than me. But we're in a limo and we're in a traffic jam in LA. It's a big LA traffic jam. She asked her assistant, Miss Stuckey, to get the whiskey out. Miss Stuckey says, "Do you want ice and stuff, Miss Angelou?" She says, "I want a little bit of ice and a lot of stuff." And yeah, that was the end of it. The traffic jam went on for quite a long time and the whiskey kept going. Particularly poignant for me because I had tickets to see Maya Angelou at the Assembly Rooms just up the road. And the night before I was due to see her, my mother died. So I couldn't go. And there's quite a lot of personal essays in here. The last chapter is called Me, Myself, I. And I write about my mum, I write about myself, leaving America, traveling around Europe. They're two separate articles. About Barbados reaching 50th anniversary and how my mum died when she was 44, so she never got that chance. And I will read a little bit from one of the pieces just to end. I was asked right at the beginning of promoting the book, well, what draws all these things together? And I was a little bit stumped because it was right at the beginning and I wasn't expecting a question. And I said, which is not untrue, it's just vain. I said, well, me, I draw them together, right? Because I'm the only person who's in all of these places, you know, it's a bit Forrest Gumpy. But it did make me think. And I feel that there are two strands, and they overlap, that you will find at least one of them in each piece, and often both of them in each piece. And one of those strands is love. It can be political love, not romantic love really, but love of kind of self, the kind of that element of black power which is about loving yourself. Those people in South Africa dancing and ululating and chanting, there's love there. The love of the mother who sits in court with her son who's been accused and was convicted of killing another child with a knife. The love that's exhibited when she bumps into the father of the boy he killed in the court and they throw their arms around each other. And she says, I'm so sorry. And he says, all I wanted was justice for my son. And she says, I'm sorry. I'm just sorry. So love in unlikely places, but also resistance. Obviously South Africa, also Zimbabwe, Macpherson report, the uprisings in France in 2005, the resistance that embodies, in a sense, an inescapable element of black life in the late 20th century, that you resist or you die. That, you know, and every now and then that resistance becomes mass and collective and reshapes how other people are thinking and how other people understand you. But if you go back to imagining that there aren't more people being shot dead by cops, we're just taking more notice, then you can see how much resistance there had to be for so long just to keep going when that number of people are being shot dead by the state. And you're living in a state of terror. And so those, I would say, would be the two themes that are central to the book. So, just to round off, I'm going to read from the last piece that I wrote for The Guardian, which was in January 2020, last piece I wrote for The Guardian when I was working there full time. And the one thing to remember is that there was the election in December 2019, which I don't know about all of you, but didn't go quite how I wanted it to. When I was a child, my mother used to put on the song Young, Gifted and Black by Bob and Marcia. Put my feet on hers and then dance us both around the living room. They're playing our song, should say. It was the early 70s. She was barely 30 and I was the youngest of 3 children she was raising alone. Struggling to believe there was a viable future for her children in a country where racism was on the rise and the economy was in the tank, we danced around the living room, singing ourselves up, imagining a world in which we would thrive, for which we had no evidence, though we did have great expectations. Much of the politics that has informed my writing came from my mum. It's partly rooted in her experience. She came to Britain just a month after the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962. She came because the then Health Minister, Enoch Powell, had embarked on a colossal program of NHS restructuring that required more nurses. She was living proof of the immigrants that the British economy needs, but that its political culture is too toxic to embrace. For her, sex, race, and class were not abstract identities, but forces that converged to keep her wages low and her life stressful. But my politics is also rooted in what she made of those experiences. She was an anti-colonialist and an anti-racist, an internationalist and a humanist who would never have used any of those words to describe herself. Race-conscious as she was, most of her community activism, youth clubs, literacy classes, discos in a church hall, took place in the working-class white community. They were her people too. She made me stay up when I was 10 and watch the Holocaust miniseries, which freaked me out. When I was 14, she took me to watch Gandhi, which was way too long. Both times she told me, this is your story too. She believed the world she wanted to create was never going to come to her, so she would have to take the fight to it. I saw her confront the local National Front candidate, the police and her union, to name but a few. She took me on my first rally, Help the Aged, when I was 4. My first demonstration, CND, when I was 14. And my first picket, the South African Embassy, at 17. Even in her sudden and untimely death, there were valuable lessons. That life is too short to waste time on people you don't care about, but long enough to make a difference if you want to. She was 44, I was 19. She never got to read my columns. My presence at The Guardian or as a professor would have been, I think, as unlikely to her as almost anything else she hoped I might achieve as a child as we padded around the living room. I sign off from this column just a month after the election at a dispiriting time, with racism, cynicism and intolerance on the rise, wages stagnant, and faith that progressive change is possible declining even as resistance grows. Things look bleak. The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it. Thank you.
Well, that was very, very inspiring. Can I ask you a few questions?
Please, yes. No maths questions.
All right, let's get started. Okay, so my first question is, Dispatches from the Diaspora has a visionary quality to it that is reminiscent of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. When you wrote Farewell to America in 2015, not in 2020, when one would expect to read about imminent uprisings, was this piece subject to any controversy? Were you considered a reactionary, Cassandra? What was the reader response?
So the piece was written as I was leaving America, and it's a fairly standard thing when a foreign correspondent is leaving, particularly, usually foreign correspondents stay for 4 or 5 years. I've been for 12. And there are very few black foreign correspondents. And I left at this combustible time. Now, in reflection, quite a lot of the time that I was there was combustible, but there had been Ferguson and the killing of Michael Brown. There had been Trayvon Martin. Obama was about to go. And I had been on something of a journey while I had been there that I was the same. Well, it's that thing that you never cross the same river twice because you're different and the river's different. And America had changed, but I had changed too. When I arrived there, my wife is African American, but I didn't have kids, for example. When I arrived, there was an anthropology about the place. There was a distance. You know, in 2003, I was reporting in Mississippi, and I stopped to ask some people some directions. It was rural Mississippi, and could you tell me the way to Rock Cut Road? And the man said, "We got a gun." I was like, okay. Well, I just want to go to Rock Cut Road, though. So if you can just, we're going to shoot you, we got a gun. And I couldn't, I was like, this is crazy. And I knew enough not to go on his property. And it's rural Mississippi, so you don't know when's the next time you're going to catch someone. So I asked again, and then if he didn't go out and get a gun. So I thought I better go. So I got in the car and I drove off. And when I got back to New York, I told my wife, and her brother was also in the house, what I thought was a kind of funny, weird story. And they listened, and then they're like, "You're an idiot." And I said, No, I don't think so. And they're like, "Why are you going around Mississippi asking white people for directions?" I said, "Because I didn't know where I was." And they're like, "You just don't do that. You just don't do that." And there was a sense of, I'm not sure that they were right about that, actually, although obviously in that particular instance it didn't really work out. But because neither of them had ever been to Mississippi, whereas I'd actually spent more time than both of them in Mississippi. But the reason I'd been able to spend more time than both of them in Mississippi is because I'd read about Mississippi, but there was a distance for me between it and me, whereas for them, not so much. In the same way that their parents could ask me about the Queen, and I'd be like, "Don't talk to me about the Queen. Don't even raise her name in the house. I don't want to, but, what do you think about William marrying a commoner?" I'd be like, "I don't even know what you're talking about." Like, what? But to them, it's anthropology, it's exotic. And by the time I left, I had 2 kids. And so this piece was a kind of partly a reflection on how my relationship to the place had changed, but also that the place had changed. And that, specifically with your question, clearly, and I think it's very important that journalists, we're not soothsayers. So some journalists think it's their job to predict the future. It's not. It's to describe the present. And maybe in the present there are some clues as to what might happen. And it just seemed pretty clear to me that, there was a lot of oil on the floor, and all it needed was a spark. Now, I don't know when that spark is going to come, and what the alchemy in that moment would be. And there were plenty of other moments between when I left in 2015 and George Floyd. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know specifically what it was about George Floyd's murder that made it totemic in the way that it did. Because while it was outrageous, it wasn't extraordinary. It's actually kind of more or less a daily occurrence somewhere. And it's not that it was caught on camera, because lots of them are caught on camera. I don't really know why that became the totemic thing that it did. So there was a sense that, it was a dog bites man thing. It was like, look, you can't just go on killing people like this and think that nothing's going to happen. And the response to the piece was mostly positive. And interestingly, it was, because it did 2 things that are kind of quite rare. First of all, you very rarely get a black person doing the anthropologizing, right? So for me to be saying, well, this is funny, we're usually anthropologized. And you relatively rarely get America being anthropologized in that way. The Americans go elsewhere and they talk about other countries, but they don't expect to be talked about. And so for those two reasons, I think that the response was fairly positive. And I also think it didn't come from a kind of predictable place. That an awful lot of stuff that's written about America by Brits is either, I thought America sucked, but now I think it's wonderful, or I thought it's wonderful, but now I suck. But how wonderful is America? Do you know what I mean? As opposed to, God, this place is complicated and kind of ugly in ways and not in others. And there's quite a lot of space in that kind of, if you don't choose to look at it as somewhere that has to be either revered or loathed, but just interrogated. So there was that too.
Thank you. Let's go for another one, huh? So this book feels very personal in its organization and content. What was behind the decision to mix your journalistic objectivity with the subjectivity of the pieces about your personal life?
Well, there are some journalists who never write about themselves, and that's fine. Like, first of all, they might not have much to say. That's not a criticism. They really might, that might just not be their thing. And some people, it makes them feel uncomfortable. And obviously you don't write about everything about yourself. But my feeling has always been, I don't believe in objectivity. I believe in fairness. But everybody comes from somewhere. Everybody brings something to their perspective. If we didn't think that, then we'd be saying that I would have the same views if I was born female in the Bengal in 1960, or if I was born white and in Sweden, right? And it doesn't determine how we see the world, but it shapes how we see the world. It shapes the books we read. I'm guessing that most people in this room didn't dance around to Young, Gifted and Black on their mum's feet. Some maybe, but others not. Most not. And that's partly about when you were born. That's partly about your race and ethnicity. That's partly about the music taste of your parents. So we all come with something. And actually laying that out and unpacking it is a very, I think, can be a very useful thing. And by and large, the people who don't think that they come from somewhere are the people who kind of have everything laid out for them. Right? So nobody ever asked me, well, when did you figure out that you were straight? Because straight people don't get asked that question. There's an assumption that everybody's straight apart from the people that aren't. Nobody ever asked me, how did you balance being a foreign correspondent with having small children? Because men never get asked that question. Women do. And so the more powerful your identity, the less likely you are to interrogate it. And so you think, well, I come from this place because everybody comes from this place. Well, you know, they don't. So for the kind of journalism I do, I find it useful and helpful. Not inevitable, but useful and helpful.
You know, Gary, this is a really special moment for me. It really is. All right, so let me get a grip. I fangirled out. Now I'm going to reel it back in. So when has your integrity been tested the most during your career as a journalist? Did you pass the test, and how did you do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this will seem like a very roundabout way to answer. I have some actually specific, at least one specific answer. But I remember, and I'm obviously I'm not comparing myself here to Nelson Mandela. I'm not doing that. I wouldn't do that to you. But I remember covering his funeral and thinking, and there's a piece in there about covering his funeral, and thinking, wow, you took on this system, you got to the head of it, and you died in your bed. That doesn't usually happen. And that's amazing. That is amazing. That you lived this long and you died in your bed. And you don't get to do that without being strategic and without making compromises. And quite often, when we think we're being strategic, we might be being cowardly. It's a harsh word, but I think it's true. Sometimes we think, oh, you know, maybe I shouldn't raise that right now. It could be that you're right. Or it could be that you don't want to pay the price for it. And you're never going to get it right all the time. You just have to hope that you get it right most of the time, I think. Because I think that being strategic is quite important. And that to be in journalism for 30 years, to have written in support of rioting, in support of Palestinians, to write articles with headlines like, we need to have an open and honest conversation about white people, or I hate Tories. And to have the kind of career I've had, you don't get that without being strategic. And being strategic means making compromises. Now, what feels like the clearest test of my integrity was right at the beginning of my career. Like, I was an intern at a radio, TV program called The World This Week. I was using my languages, and one of which was French, and nobody else in the office spoke French. And I was asked to call Jean-Marie Le Pen and invite him on the show. It was my last week of what would you call it? Like, at the end of that month, they could have fired me or I could have walked. Right? It was of my probation. And I took a walk around the block, and I just thought, if I'm going to start, at the start of my career, if I'm going to make that call, then what the hell am I going to be like in 20 years' time? And there's no case for this. This is titillation, it's spectacle. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I kind of took a deep breath, and I went in and I said, look, I understand. I was a Trotskyist for a year, so I'm all about the line of command. So I was like, I understand that you can fire me for this. It's insubordination, but I'm not going to make that call because I don't think it's justified journalistically, and I don't think it's justified morally. And this is the end of my probation period, so you've seen what I can do, and this is something that I won't do. And truth be told, the stakes were pretty low for both of us, in a sense. It wasn't my full-time job. I did not have children. It was like you could barely cut my wages because they were barely paying me anything. Mm-hmm. And for him, it was a kind of whim anyway. It wasn't like a hill that he needed to kind of die on. And, you know, he told me something about enlightenment values or some bollocks like that, and kind of freedom of speech. And I was like, whatever, you know, I'm not doing it. And so it was definitely, that was definitely a test. quite often the test is about, well, there are these performative tests, which are, in that moment, do you speak up? Do you not speak up? Do you challenge? Do you not challenge? You're never going to get that right all the time. It's not that it doesn't matter, but sometimes it might be a bad day for you, you know. And I really do think we have to be more generous with each other. The left, in particular, has a habit of eating its young, and we have to be more generous than that. But there is a broader thematic thing, which is, are you going to leave the place in a better situation than you found it? That's the test. Are you going to check in on people? Even when they're doing wrong, are you going to check in on them? And are you going to, if you can't figure it out in that moment, are you going to find a way to make sure that what you're doing is strategic and not cowardly? Are you going to find a way to kind of, it's fine to say, I'm going to keep my powder dry, I'm not going to do that right now, I'm going to do that some other time. But when that time comes, are you going to be ready? Are you going to be more ready than you were last time? And I guess all I want to say that you never completely get that right. And that's quite important thing to say, because there is a version of this conversation where I say to you, I've been 100% completely moral all the time. Any time I call it out, I did this, I did. Well, I don't. You know, and I don't because I just think, sometimes I just think, oh, Jesus, I can't believe he said that. Sometimes I think I'm going to need to figure out how this works. And sometimes, if I'm honest, I might not want to take it on. And then you have to have a word with yourself.
Okay, thank you. So what advice do you have for early career journalists in this age of AI and fake news?
So, it's not particularly original, but there would be two main things, given those challenges, particularly the kind of fake news stuff. One, and there is, I don't know who it was who said this, but it's a useful way to understand a journalist's role. That if one person says it's raining and another person says it's not raining, it's not your job to say, well, these people say this and these people say that. It's your job to go out and see if it's fucking raining. And then talk about the weather in an intelligent way. And so that kind of, that both sidesism, and you can only do that to the best of your ability. But if you don't do that, if you think that your job is to kind of cut the difference, then you can cut the difference between madness and stupidity. And you're not informing people, you're just helping out with the disinformation. And these things, they get to a point where everybody says, well, that's crazy. But actually, kind of, Trump didn't invent the whole fake news notion. Just think of the Iraq war. Think of the war that's going on now in the Middle East. That issue of kind of trusting our news media is a perennial one. Think of the Cold War. He took it to new levels, and social media caffeinates it, but it's not new. The other thing is context. That it used to be, even in my lifetime, your ability to run to a place, to see the thing, was kind of paramount. Now it's important, but somebody's probably already there, and they've probably recorded it on their phone. And everybody has the means to distribute and amplify and record. And that doesn't mean that you not being there, you should still go. But actually, there is a premium, I think, on context now and analysis, that what happened, sometimes precisely what happened, if you think of the bombing of the hospital in Gaza, for example, sometimes the issue of exactly what happened is urgent and divided, and it necessitates good journalism. But even if we just take this current story, the context of this moment, of 67, of the Oslo Accords, of the Nakba, of the Holocaust, of the Yom Kippur War, of all of these things matter. And that kind of, and that it behoves us as journalists not to be encyclopedic. Journalists aren't doing the work of academics, but they're not doing the work of ambulance drivers either. Just running to a place, saying what they saw, running to the next place. And so context and analysis, but context is important.
Okay, my next question is actually not from me, but from Ahmed. Thank you for this complicated and long question, Ahmed. I'll see if I can get through it and give it the proper justice. Okay. So, in your piece, Racism Rebooted, on the history of hate crimes in Mississippi, I, Ahmed, was struck by a quotation from Professor Charles Payne that some people in the South are, quote, using the progress that has been made to wipe out any sense of the past as though they have conquered the past. Could you touch on your reasons for writing Racism Rebooted? What drew you to the topic? How was your experience in Mississippi nearly 20 years ago? Is it, as the piece suggests, a place still unwilling to face its past?
So, it was while covering that story that the man threatened to shoot me. So that was part of my experience. That was part of the experience. The story is about in the 60s, during the Civil Rights era, there were a series of murders, some of which, and this was one of the interesting things about these murders. Everybody in the town knew who'd done it, and yet somehow they couldn't prosecute. And there are, for things close to home, there are real echoes of Stephen Lawrence, or Stephen Lawrence's echoes of that. And in a certain moment in the early 21st century, a number of these cases were either they were going to be prosecuted now because the people were old, or they would die in their beds, having killed other people in the street. And it was happening, that they were being prosecuted. And I went to cover the trial of Edgar Ray Killen. Well, not the trial, but the issue of Edgar Ray Killen. And for any of you who've seen Mississippi Burning is kind of prompted by that murder. 3 young civil rights workers, 2 white Jewish people from New York, 1 young black man from Mississippi, Cheney, Schreiner, and Goodman, out during what was called the Mississippi Freedom Summer, trying to register people to vote. And they are murdered by this man. But many bits of the town collude in the murder, including the sheriff's office. Now, I thought that this was interesting because it tells us something about how we understand the past and the degree to which the present is connected to the past. So it's an interesting thing that people do when they talk about kind of, for example, slavery, where they say, but that was then. Like, why are you bringing up old stuff? Like, that was before racism was bad. That's what I, that's how I characterize it. And you have to say, no, it was known at the time that like there were these people campaigning, and that, and in any case, it was bad. It's still bad, and we are still living with its legacy. So then, at what point do we then just shut off the past? And there is a curious thing that happens with British people do it, English people do it certainly. They'll say we won the war, even if they didn't fight, even if they weren't born. They'll say we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play, even if they weren't born. When you talk about colonialism, they say, well, I wasn't born. It wasn't me. And so that selective notion of collective history is untenable. And that here was an example, to me. And America does such a good job of reinvention in a way that Britain kind of sometimes doesn't even want to reinvent itself, right? If you look at the opening of Parliament and all that kind of bling and weirdness. Whereas America is in a constant state of marking its reinvention, which means it can travel light from history. And yet I say to my kids, if you want to know what it was like, just ask your grandfather. He went to a segregated school, a historically black college. He can try on shirts. He can go, like, this is in living history. People, this happened. And this was an opportunity to interrogate how this thing was understood. And, to see the elisions that people would make, Well, I think if he did it, he should definitely go to jail for it, but I don't know why they're bringing this all up now. And it's like, so you think he should go to jail, but that they shouldn't say anything. And in the town, there was no if they did it, because they all knew who'd done it. So it was a really powerful example of how a society doesn't metabolize its history. But it was also an example, and we have this here in a different way, of an attempt to park racism as being the actions of hateful old people. Not systemic, not institutional, not current. It happened, but it's not happening anymore. So there's no excuse anymore. And that this was an opportunity to draw the lines between then and now.
Okay, so I guess we're going to open things up I don't guess, we're going to open things up to you to hear what you want to ask and hopefully give you some answers.
Here we go. I'll hand right to you. Thank you for a really inspiring talk, Gary. I just had a question about social media and AI and the role of journalism. Like, what do you see the role of journalists in the terms of cutting through the noise and really getting to the point of shaping a constructive public discourse that takes into account the importance of nuance in a world where you've got 140 characters and you can be cancelled for not getting it right the first time?
Yeah, so I think that it actually clarifies the role, actually, or it should do, that anyone pretty much can have an opinion. My 10-year-old daughter has an opinion about many things. Yeah, I wouldn't read one of her columns, though. So anyone can have an opinion, but not all opinions are informed. And that there is a evidentiary, not investigatory in terms of like, crawling under crawl spaces and, rifling through files, but in terms of asking people, talking to people, being curious, that is the role of a journalist. And what we get with, and bots can't do that. And someone's, sitting in their bedroom just whacking out a series of opinions, well, they can't do that. But what a journalist can do is go somewhere and say, will you talk to me? They can pick up the phone and they can call an expert and they can say, will you talk to me? And so they can shape our understanding of what is. Now, the other thing that journalists can do, and I referred to this earlier, is lay off the predictive stuff and do more of the descriptive stuff. I can think of three examples where journalism really failed in recent past. Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership of the Labour Party, Trump and his election, and Brexit.
Yeah.
And in all three cases, journalists thought they knew better than what people were trying to say or trying to do, so none of that. That's not about indulging what people think, but actually trying to find out, why do you do that? Why do you want to do that? What is it you want to happen? And in all three cases, they completely failed. And as a result of that failure, then they think that the failure is that they didn't predict the outcome. And that's not their failure. It's not their job to predict the outcome. I remember just having arrived back in Britain, and I don't want you to get a wrong idea about my life, but I was at a cocktail party. I don't think I've been to a cocktail party since. So this was 2015, once every 8 years. Not a bad strike rate. And this woman said, well, Corbyn's lost the election. And I said, no, he just won. He just won the election. And she said, no, 2020, because everybody knew that the next election would be in 2020, because there'd been an election in 2015. And I said, are you talking about 2020 in the past tense? It's 2015. And she said, well, you know what I mean. I said, I don't know what you mean. I said, did you predict that he would win the Labour Party leadership? And she said, well, no. And I said, did you predict that the Tories would get a majority? Well, no. And I said, well, maybe you're not very good at predicting things. So maybe that's not what you should be doing. So what gives you the right to now say, 2020, this is going to happen? And that's not because I want him to win or I don't want him to win, but that's not your job. And you don't know. And your time would be better spent finding out. But anybody can say that. Anybody can say, Corbyn's going to win or lose, or Starmer's going to win or lose. That takes no great skill. So it's really that journalists have to go back to the fundamentals of their craft, talking to people, finding out, and then describing in a way that provides context, which doesn't mean that they will all agree, but at least that, which demands curiosity. And that's what there's all too little of. And that's partly because a lot of people in the journalistic world and people in the political world are the same people. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally sometimes, like Boris Johnson's going to GB News, he did work for the Telegraph, in between he was Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. But there are a higher proportion of people from private schools and Oxbridge who are columnists in newspapers than there are high court judges or lords. Newspaper columnists are posher than lords.
Thank you for that. I fear we have run out of time in this fascinating evening that could take us through most of the evening. So if we take one more urgent question in the room, and then I will check and see if there was any urgent question online. And then there will be a signing. And something I had forgotten to mention earlier is through Pay It Forward, our Pay It Forward system, where people who have the funds can buy a book and pass it on to someone. We do have copies of Gary's book available. So if you enjoyed this conversation and want to sit with these ideas more and can't afford the book, just ask for a copy on Pay It Forward and we have a copy for you. Did I see a hand? Yes. So I'm going to do this one and then that one, and we'll make them swift.
Thank you, and thank you for that fascinating talk and conversation, and also your book, which I've read, which is wonderful. I suppose my question is really about, I suppose, the danger of the disappearing investigative journalist in the world that we live in. And I take the point that the previous contributor asked about, for example, like social media, and I'm thinking particularly about the way that X, as it's now referred to, is controlled by Elon Musk, who is clearly no friend of investigative journalism, and therefore the kind of space that is opened up on social media for both the right as well as others that don't really want to have the kind of probing, the thinking, the curiosity that you're talking about. And I'm also thinking about the degree to which so much of the press in Britain, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere as well, but obviously Britain is what I know best, the degree to which there's corporate interests that also sort of dictate what is newsworthy, what gets covered, and therefore the degree of either coerced or self-censorship that sometimes can be exercised by journalists, and really what that means in the world of journalism and news and investigation where we are today. Because there was a time a decade ago when lots of people, I think, felt that the social media was the place where people who didn't have vested interests could go to, that those that were activists, that those that really wanted to try and change society, that this could be our space. And certainly the majority of people that seem to experience a very bad experience on social media also happen to be from minorities, particularly black women. So I just wondered what your comments were and thoughts were about, maybe it's quite a big ask, but yes, sort of the prospects for real investigation today. Thanks.
Shall I answer that now and then you do, or
Would you want to come up and ask a quick question? Sorry, my microphone won't go quite so far. There you go.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. My question was just, you've spoken a lot about the journalism. I just wondered if you could say anything about your life as an academic now.
So, two very good questions. The first would be, the thing about investigations is they cost money. Not all of them, but a lot of them. That they often involve people thinking there's something not quite right about that, and then having to work out what it is. So if I think of the Windrush scandal, my colleague Amelia Gentleman, a former colleague, she said at a certain point she became almost like a caseworker, that people would send her these things, and because the system was broken, in the areas where they lived, the MPs were kind of overburdened, and the immigration kind of support system had been denied. And so it takes someone with skill to sit down and go through this stuff and then turn it into a story. And so investigations, kind of to be worthy of their name, take time. And they take skill, and someone's got to pay for them. And that's not someone's got to keep Amelia Gentleman in, BMWs and big cars. Just it's a job. As one of the consequences of things going online is actually struggling to work out how to pay for journalism. There's more journalism than ever before, but there's people paying for it. And so the model has collapsed. And the model previously wasn't that great, to be honest. The model was advertising, and the journalism went in between the advertising. And if, you were considered to be too pro-Corbyn, too pro-Palestinian, what advertisers might pull their stop. In the same way that advertisers do, actually, if someone makes a kind of, a bad remark about kind of women, sometimes they will. Or, in moments after Black Lives Matter, there were moments where people withdrew. So until we have an economic model that can sustain journalism as a profession, then it's very difficult to see where investigations come from. It's also why there's so much opinion, because opinion don't cost nothing. Right? Like I said, everyone's got one. So that's the real challenge. And there are corporate interests. But what's really interesting to me, and people would often in situations like this say, did The Guardian ever tell you what to write? And I said, they don't have to tell you what to write. Not just The Guardian, I mean anywhere. They don't have to tell you what to write. I know when I write a piece called I Hate Tories, I know that is not going to go down very well for me in terms of that's just beyond the pale. And that's kind of, I got a lot of stick when I did. And I explained what I meant, and that I was talking about MPs, and these were people who had a lot and wanted more, and that I thought that it was disgusting the way that they behaved and their attacks on people, and and I didn't love Labour particularly either at that time, but that, these were, I said of David Cameron, he looked out as a young man and saw Orgreave and the cops and the miners and the poll tax, and he thought, these are my people. And that tells you something about... Anyway, that was kind of, supporting Labour's left turn under Corbyn, as I would describe it, because it wasn't really about supporting Corbyn, I don't think. It was a kind of a potentially career-damaging thing to do. That, you were asking people not to take you seriously. You were kind of constantly ridiculed. That kind of... and so people don't have to say... Right now, no one has to say, don't write a piece that's pro-Palestinian. I don't have to say that. Just try getting one in the Times. Do you know what I mean? And it's not that there aren't pieces that are pro-Palestinian, but there aren't that many of them, and mostly they're written by Palestinians. Do you know what I mean? So there are corporate interests, of course there are. And there is, hegemonic kind of ideological forces at work. But ultimately, people know where the boundaries are. And it goes back to the point about kind of cowardice and being strategic and what intervention you think is going to work and how far can you go. But I can think of about 5 or 6 pieces that I wrote that they didn't get me in trouble. It's not like, Czechoslovakia in 1970 when the Russians were in town. It's not like that. But that kind of really are going to make life difficult for you. And so there's that. With investigations in particular, it's about the model. And all of you, when you think about kind of, the media you want, you also have to think about the media you pay for. You get the media you pay for. And my guess is there's quite a lot of people in this room who don't pay. And then you're getting the media you pay for. My shift to academia was partly the response to a kind of morbidness in myself, which was I got to 50 and I thought of The Guardian, do I want to die here? I thought, I don't think I do. And this was the job, this was basically the only job I'd had. and I'd taught before, and I liked teaching, and it was something that I thought with practice I could be good at, although I'm not actually doing any teaching in Manchester, very little. I had been a visiting professor at Brooklyn College when I was in the US, and I decided that I wanted to try and say more about less. That journalism, Gary, we need 800 words on this. We need 1,200 words on this. For about, 12 years, a bit longer, I had to have an idea every Thursday. It's mental. Not Friday, it's no good. Not Wednesday. I had to have an idea every Thursday. And it was supposed to be a different idea every week. Nobody has that many ideas. So you find yourself kind of cannibalizing the things that you've done, so I wanted to sort of take a minute. And my experience so far in academia is that I've been trying to figure out what it is. That it is everybody does it differently, more so than most other professions, I think. There are people who only teach, there are people who only do research, there are people who write articles, there are people who write books. And I can't exactly work out, first of all, which is the one I'm supposed to do, and then which is the one that I want to do. And maybe that's the joy of it, that you never find out. I found it's quite an unhappy place. Lots of people are quite unhappy. And, when I joined academia, my academic friends were like, you make sure that you answer this and don't get... And I was like, I will become cynical about this in my own time. But there was a degree of which I'm trying to avoid. And so far I've been having I've been quite enjoying it. And I will end, this is a true story, but kind of light, that my daughter, who was 7 at the time, I started about a week after lockdown. So one of my first emails was like, don't come here, we're closed. And my daughter asked me, or said to me about 4 or 5 months in to my job, she said, Daddy, you need to get a job. And I said, I've got a job. She says, no, you don't. And I said, I do. I'm a professor. She said, you're not a professor. I said, I am. Honestly, I'm a professor. She said, you're not a professor. You just walk around in the house in your pants reading books. And I said, that's the job. That's the job. Yeah. So, that's as far as I got, really. Sometimes I do wear trousers.
Okay.
I just want to say a big thank you to Nicole for hosting. Thank you so much, Gary, for opening the book fair with so much insight and wisdom and grace and laughs. We have lots of books